All right, well, we're doing our best to kick off a series of videos and podcasts that we'll publish on Sundays. I have a working title called Sundays with Stories. And in these discussions, we're going to feature a person's story. Maybe it'll be someone in the news or a famous individual, or maybe just a person with something interesting to talk about. And the hope is that their life story is interesting enough on its own that we could just stand alone. But our main focus, of course, is on using the story as a case study to illuminate some of the principles that are put forth by our life process program. Today, we're going to talk about Drew Barrymore and her relationship with substances and her relationship with, well, recovery. And I'm here with the creator of the life process program, Dr. Stanton Peele, who has a particular interest in this story. Stanton, how are you?
I'm good, Zach. And I think this is a great idea because Drew Barrymore has always been in the news.
Yeah.
Since the 1980s, but she's reappeared and there's an important story that she has to tell. And strangely enough, she's not going to tell the story. So it's fallen on you and me to tell her story.
I think she's okay with that.
I don't know. I wanted to, as a preamble, I hope just a minute apiece. Drew Barrymore is part of a myth, and everything we hear, virtually everything we hear about drugs and alcohol, treatment, addiction, treatment, and recovery are myths. So I just wanted to knock off 5 myths, minute each, if I might.
Okay, let's do it.
In 2018, Mother Jones came out in support of Mormon alcohol policies. Mother Jones, of course, is a really progressive magazine, and yet they had a woman write that we should be like Utah and the Mormons. She grew up in Utah, and of course, you're not allowed to drink at all if you're a Mormon. And as she put it, she drank more then than she ever drank when she was legally able to drink. And she got breast cancer, and she blames it on that. And yet, in the most progressive magazine in the United States, she presented the Mormon view of alcohol, and a progressive magazine backed it 100%, that it shouldn't be used at all. And when she was growing up, the Mormon law was actually not to allow children to actually see alcohol. They would black off the bar so that children would not even see alcohol. It sounds like the medieval ages, doesn't it?
I was thinking the same thing, yeah.
And a progressive magazine authored that. I wrote about that whole thing for Filter Magazine. In 2011, I wrote about a Yale University addiction specialist who's there, their prevention program, who said that drinking caffeine and alcohol is fatal and you should never do it. From Yale, the professor, of course, Kahlua and other alcohol is made from coffee beans. And of course, Irish coffee combines alcohol and caffeine. So here's a man saying that popular liquors and drinks that people have been drinking for hundreds of years will kill you. Let me jump to somebody we know. Popular magazines have promoted Naltrexone and Balcovin as cures for alcoholism. We know a woman, we admire her, who's written recently. She's written for The Atlantic. She's written for Filter. Radiolab, which is a prestigious science publication, has also presented the idea that Naltrexone and Balcovin, this is their argument, would cure alcoholism, but they're somehow being suppressed by American medicine. I'll just quickly point out, no study has ever found Naltrexone to be, in a controlled study, to be effective for treating alcoholism, none. And Charles O'Brien, who's Mr. Disease at the University of Pennsylvania, came to a conclusion why that was. He proposed that the specific chemical structure of naltrexone would only affect a certain genetic profile. So they took a group of alcoholics, alcoholism patients, they divided them in terms of their genetic profile. They did a double-blind study. You're going to have a PhD to understand this little segment. where neither the researchers nor the subjects knew whether they were getting placebo or naltrexone. And every one of the measures, quickness to drink again, amount drunk when you drank again, amount drunk on the highest amount, tendency to relapse, and overall recovery, not one single measure differed on either genetic group called an allele, whether it was administered by naltrexone or placebo. And this is being presented. Radiolab is famous for presenting sophisticated scientific information.
And being parsimonious about it.
What's that?
And they're famous ostensibly for being parsimonious about it.
And for, pointing out fake science.
Right.
Well, I'll jump to my conclusion here. We all despise Donald Trump's anti-scientific attitude about climate change, about treating the pandemic. I make the modest argument that progressives are as bad as Republicans when it comes to considering drugs and alcohol and presenting anti-scientific information as though it were true. And let me jump to Kurt Anderson is a distinguished broadcaster, writer, fiction and nonfiction. He has a new bestseller out, Evil Geniuses. His previous book was called Fantasyland, How America Went Haywire, where he talks about irrationality, how Americans will believe any irrational thing. Kurt Anderson, as a columnist for New York Magazine, proposed that George Bush bombed Iraq because he quit drinking without going to AA. Quite a brilliant man.
Yeah.
He said because George W. Bush quit drinking without AA, he was subject to denial, and that denial made him unaware of the consequences of bombing Iraq. You've
mentioned before you can't go wrong with that story, no matter how bizarre it is.
Right. A brilliant man proposed of course, every part of it is wrong. The idea that nobody quits drinking without AA, that if you do so, you endanger your psychiatric health, that AA is good for you psychiatrically, and then you'll do some horrible crime as a result of doing that. It's bizarre and extreme. I'll just do something contemporary now. There's a man running for Congress in New York. He's running for re-election. His main ad is to say how many people are dying of painkillers currently in New York City, and to blame that on drug companies. And his pitch for getting elected is saying, let's lock up drug company executives and throw away the key because they're causing the heroin, the opioid death pandemic. Opioid prescriptions have been going steadily downward since 2013. And every year, 2019, the first half of 2020, has seen new record levels of deaths due to opioids. And so let me draw through two conclusions. You can say anything bad about drugs and alcohol and get away with it. And that's part of our temperance tradition. We hate and talk to even upper class progressives like the editors of Mother Jones magazine secretly, and they drink better educated people drink more than poorly educated and less well-off people. Even recognizing their own behavior, they'll jump out in front of the train like Kurt Anderson and say something bad about alcohol and drugs, no matter what their own how their own behavior belies it, A. And B, you can never go wrong endorsing recovery bromides, saying how great AA and the disease theory are, no matter how many. We're now experiencing 350% more deaths per annum due to drugs than we did in 1999. And that's backed by, and at the same time that we've cut opioid prescriptions, at the same time that now medically assisted treatment like naltrexone has spread nationwide. And everybody's on board with that. from the Drug Policy Alliance on through the National Institute on Drug Abuse. No amount of deaths, failures, obvious logical inconsistency, belying our own behavior can undercut our desire to follow the disease myths and the temperance myths of drugs and alcohol. Which brings us to my heroine, Drew Barrymore. I love Drew Barrymore. And like everybody, I followed her whole life story. When she was 13 years old, she appeared on the cover of People magazine, America's Youngest Addict. She had a little undirected family life. She was going to dance clubs, snorting cocaine and drinking. And People had a great article where a psychiatrist by the name of Miller said her father was a heroin, addicted to heroin. Her grandfather, John Barrymore, was a famous alcoholic. She obviously had inherited the genetic ability, the genetic trait of addiction and alcoholism. She would never be able to drink for the rest of her life or take drugs. She would always be addicted.
I said I wouldn't do this, but how old was she then? She was less
13.
than 13 years. She's 13?
She went to rehab. She attempted suicide, which enabled her to write a book at 19, when she was 15 called
Little Girl
Lost.
Yeah.
So what happened to Drew Barrymore? The born addict, the youngest addict who went to rehab and attempted suicide. Well, she continued to act, and she was successful. And she played an ingenue in 1999. She appeared in a picture called Never Been Kissed. At that time, Drew Barrymore was born in 1975. She was 24 years old. So at 24, she was kind of highly successful. By the year 2000, shortly thereafter, she made Charlie's Angels. She starred in that. It made a lot of money, and she co-produced it. So we're now getting to a human being who is under 30 years old and is a Hollywood power player. And one would suspect she was not a drug addict or an alcoholic. It's a little hard to act every day and produce multi-million-dollar projects when you're an addicted individual. And then strangest thing of all happened in 2012. She founded a winery. And, you know, they showed her happily drinking wine and discussing this wine and that wine. And then there was an outburst. I wrote about this, and people would write into Psychology Today saying, she's obviously what? She's obviously in denial and relapse. But she kept going on from success to success. So the denial relapse story had a hard time holding water. And she then, for the last couple of years, 2017 to 2019, she's been in this highly successful Netflix series, The Clarita Diet, which she also co-produces. So how would you describe what happened to Drew Barrymore? She was at an age in a very disoriented family situation. Her mother wasn't really present, where she used cocaine and alcohol in an unhealthy way. She became persuaded that she needed to be in rehab and she had a disease. That resulted in her almost killing herself. She continued on her path, following her talents and her skills, became incredibly successful both as a performer and as a producer. She had 2 daughters along the way. And she speaks often about her feeling of obligation and responsibility, given her own background, rather than the story we often hear, well, people from broken homes become horrible parents themselves. That redoubled her energy and her effort to raise her own children in a well role modeled way. And now she's coming to do, in 2020, a new television talk show. How is America dealing with Drew Barrymore, and how is Drew Barrymore dealing with herself? And the secret answer is Drew Barrymore is a person who almost more than any other human being could come before America and say, you know that whole, I had a lifetime disease because my grandfather was an alcoholic. I'm not recommending that my daughters take cocaine when they're 13, but that whole thing about me being a lifetime addict was bullshit. Putting me in rehab at that age was crazy and almost killed me. Having some support and nurturance and using my talents, becoming a parent myself, allowed me to grow up as a fully functioning adult. I drank wine normally. I have no fear whatsoever of becoming re-addicted or alcoholic. What a crazy story. I bet that's never happened in the history of the world before. And we all know, if we read Mother Jones magazine or The Atlantic, or sometimes, forgive me, even Filter magazine, we'll learn that you've come up with a disease, you're in denial, and you need medical treatment. So Drew Barrymore has something really important to tell us, and she can't tell it to us. Why can't Drew Barrymore tell the story that just because John Barrymore is an alcoholic and she was addicted or disoriented from cocaine, that didn't determine the rest of her life, that she just had to grow up and now she can be a normal substance consumer? Why can't she tell that story? So first, let me tell the story that Drew Barrymore does tell. And it's a tough story to swallow. She tells people the recovery community has been really important to her. She seeks support from recovery people. However, she's not in recovery, because you're not allowed to be in recovery and drink wine. That's a fine line to navigate. I love recovery people. She says rehab was really important. Well, she did attempt suicide after going to rehab. She's not going to AA meetings and drinking wine. As you're aware, they don't have wine at recovery meetings, only coffee. And so she has to make common cause with the recovery community in Hollywood and America, which is really powerful, even though every aspect of her life belies their message. And recovery groups, you know, the same ones who around 2012 said she's obviously in denial starting this winery, they now have to drive this fine line where they say things like, well, she's doing very well. Of course, nobody in recovery should be drinking. No, it almost never happens that can succeed. So please don't try and follow her model. They have to commend her. America loves her. She's going to have a talk show where she's going to be rivaling, you know, Ellen DeGeneres. They can't be cutting her up and saying she's an alcoholic in denial. So they're doing a dance. Drew and the alcohol recovery industry are doing a dance. Well, she's not in recovery, but she's sort of in recovery. She's defying everything we say in recovery, but we love her, and she really proves our point that you can't do what she's doing, just outgrow addiction. And that's the situation that we're facing with Drew Barrymore. She's telling a false story about herself. And so the greatest lesson that we learn from Drew Barrymore is, in fact, as you and I have discussed, and as you and I, we discussed Drew Barrymore in Filter magazine. God bless Filter magazine and its great editorial staff, an editor-in-chief. And our book is called Outgrowing Addiction, which you may recognize. That title sounds a lot like what happened to Drew Barrymore. We have to tell her story, because otherwise you are not allowed to actually hear Drew Barrymore's story in the United States of America. You can't hear it from her. You can hear it from addiction treatment specialists. I always wonder about looking up that psychiatrist Miller, who wrote for People magazine so assuredly that she would be addicted for the rest of her life and could never ever drink, but would probably relapse throughout her adult life. I wonder whatever became of it. And that's the first story in our series that we want to tell. The story of Drew Barrymore growing up to become a fully functioning, wine-drinking, excellent mother and super professional, violating every precept of the recovery fairy tale.